So let's talk about respiratory buffering, which is a continuation of the series we're doing here on acid-base balance. And again, it's always about returning to homeostasis. So this is going to be about, in particular, the respiratory system, and actually it's going to be in particular about respiratory acidosis. So this chemical reaction is something that you should know by heart. You don't need to know about covalent bonds and that type of stuff and hydrolysis and that kind of stuff. You really don't. But you just need to remember the byproducts of this chemical reaction. So CO2 and H2O is what is excreted by the lungs. We'll talk about that. But CO2 and H2O is transported in the body as H2CO3, which is carbonic acid. Okay? So this is carbonic acid right here. That's what we breathe out of our lungs, right? Expelled. And how do we get carbonic acid? Well, let's say a hydrogen ion is free floating, which we don't want, right? We already mentioned that. It will link up with, this is bicarbonate. It will link up with that and form carbonic acid. Okay, so carbonic acid is great because it helps us get rid of hydrogen ions. Why is it great? Because if we didn't have the ability to form carbonic acid in our blood, we couldn't transport those ions to the places they need to be, like the lungs. So whenever the lungs excrete CO2 and H2O, which they do, that's 2 hydrogen ions leaving the body, right? You need to know that chemical reaction by heart, generally speaking, for any class and any level of care. So we have hemoglobin in our body, and you should know about that. And it's an extra intracellular buffer because its ability to bind with hydrogen ions, which literally forms carbonic acid. Hemoglobin is what transports carbonic acid to the lungs, right? So what we like to do is get rid of the carbonic acid, and then once that's off the hemoglobin molecule, then it can take on oxygen, and that happens over and over again. Now, I'm not going to go over too much anatomy and physiology, but that's the way that your lungs work on a regular basis. It's important because as CO2 accumulates, more of it needs to be taken out of the body. If it wasn't for the lungs' ability to get rid of CO2, we would end up in acidosis almost immediately. So we already talked about it, but CO2 is the byproduct of cellular metabolism. The human body is a pretty amazing thing, and when things are working well, CO2 is the primary stimulation to breathe. The body often works in what would be considered a very logical way. Why would we want to increase respirations as a result of CO2 levels? Well, CO2 levels are a direct reflection of how much metabolism is happening, isn't it? Right? So again, metabolism ends up creating, through aerobic respiration, CO2 and hydrogen ions. We need that to be out of the body. So the body can sense CO2 levels very, 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 very accurately and quickly in the brainstem. Whenever it senses CO2 levels rising, it will naturally increase respiratory rate. So you don't have to do anything. That's all automatic. That's all autonomic nervous system. So to use the example from the previous slideshows, running up a flight of stairs will immediately increase your CO2. Quite literally immediately. Those chemical reactions happen immediately and the byproducts happen immediately. So much like revving the car up to 2,000 RPM, that exhaust is immediately expelled. Same thing, except it takes a little bit more time. So you run up a flight of stairs, you need more energy, you create it, no issue, you have the oxygen necessary, and so CO2 and hydrogen is created. Immediately your brainstem increases your respiratory rate and depth to get rid of those things. So that's why running up a flight of stairs, you immediately take longer, deeper breaths at a quicker rate and expel that. And then you go back to homeostasis and you don't pay attention to the fact that you're breathing. Just about, or actually every single time your metabolism is increased, the first thing that's going to happen is an increase in respiratory rate. And that's good, and that's normal, and that's the respiratory system working normally, okay? CO2 is transported to the lungs as carbonic acid, and then CO2 and hydrogen is expelled. Again, it takes 1 to 3 minutes to actually affect the human body. So again, you run up a flight of stairs, it's going to happen immediately, and depending on your level of fitness, cardiovascular fitness in particular, that will determine the amount of time it takes to get back to homeostasis. But the point is, it'll happen quickly no matter what. Okay, cool. So let's say we totally get that. That means that your respirations affect CO2. Okay, pretty easy to understand. The more you breathe, the less CO2 you'll have, and the less you breathe, the more CO2 you'll have. That has profound effects on the human body, okay? So what we're looking at now means I can manually decide to change my acid-base balance based on my respirations. If I wanted to right now change my respirations to take massive breaths at a quick rate, I could deplete my body of CO2, I could deplete my body of hydrogen ions, and I could quite literally put myself into an alkalotic state. And the opposite is true as well. So we're going to explore those concepts, because not only is the respiratory system a great buffer system if it's working well, it can cause extreme deviations of acid-base balance if it's not working well. So before we get into that, you need to know the definition of two different types of acids, which is a volatile acid or a fixed acid. Okay? There's different types of acids in the body depending on the different chemical reactions happening, right? But a volatile acid is an acid that can be excreted from the lung. A volatile acid is carbonic acid. That is the volatile acid, okay? So I had mentioned earlier that lactic acid is something that the body might create. There's other stuff too, but lactic acid is not a volatile acid. Okay, so that means lactic acid cannot be excreted by the lungs. So that's the lungs' major downfall here. It can't deal with fixed acids. It can't. There's nothing it can do for fixed acids. That's a big problem. That means that that respiratory system is essentially not even on the bench in terms of dealing with fixed acids. There's nothing it can do to help. So we have to know what kind of acids are being created by the body, because we want to know if the respiratory system can help or if it has no effect at all. So volatile acids get excreted by the lungs, right? And this is one of the reasons that we say that the kidneys are much more efficient than the lungs, because the lungs can only get rid of volatile acids. So therefore, as an all-around mechanism to control acid-base balance, they're not extremely efficient because there's certain acids they can't deal with at all. Another thing to keep in mind about the lungs is they're much like homeostasis is constantly changing from 7.4. So we're always going to go up to somewhere close to 7.45 and down to 7.35 and try to get back to the middle. Respirations are doing the same thing. So when you learn about a human being, you learn respirations are like a regular respiration rate would be something like 12 to 18 would be totally normal. And you could deviate from that. But it wouldn't, if you measured respirations in a day of a human being, they don't just sit at 12. That's crazy, right? Because respirations are a direct reflection of metabolism, and they'll increase as metabolism increases. So throughout the day, as you're doing various stuff, like even just walking or maybe even playing a game of chess, anything that requires a slight increase in energy demand will result in an increase in metabolism and therefore an increase in respirations. Another thing to keep in mind is there's many different mechanisms that increase or decrease respirations that have nothing to do with this, right? So if you startle somebody, their respirations will immediately increase due to a sympathetic reaction. That has nothing to do with acid-base balance, but it will still affect acid-base balance because the respirations are increased and you're going to be getting rid of CO2 at a quicker rate. So we're going to talk about respiratory acidosis in particular, and we're not going to talk about respiratory alkalosis yet. Before we even talk about that, let's break down the word respiratory acidosis. So acidosis, we already know it has to do with the pH dropping below 7.4. That's not the ideal internal environment of the body. It's acidotic, and so we call that acidosis. Respiratory implies that the acidosis is caused due to something to do with the respiratory system. We'll keep it as vague as that for now. I had mentioned earlier that we don't have blood work, and we likely never will in the pre-hospital environment. But we do have an extraordinarily useful tool, and it's useful for a bajillion things, but we're just going to focus on the acid-base balance aspect of it for now. That's called end-tidal carbon dioxide. So EtCO2, the first line you see on the slide. EtCO2 is end-tidal carbon dioxide. End-tidal refers to tidal volume, and tidal volume is the amount of air that's expelled and then breathed in from your lungs. Okay, so there's lots of different metrics to measure respiration, but tidal volume is the most basic one and it's the easiest to understand. How much air goes in and how much air comes out. Okay, let's say you want to measure this CO2 being created by the human body at any given time. That would be super useful based on what we know about CO2, wouldn't it? Because that would let you know the amount of metabolism happening in the body at any given time. How quickly are these chemical reactions happening? Actually, it would be so useful that it would even let you know if the body was currently in an acidotic state. Is the body creating more acids than it can get rid of right now? I want to know live. That's how handy EtCO2 is. Let's say you wanted to measure that. You wouldn't want to measure the CO2 leaving the body as soon as you exhale, because it wouldn't be a great reflection of the CO2 in the blood. You would want to measure the air at the absolute end of that expiration, at the absolute end of the tidal volume. And that's why this is called end-tidal CO2. It's the CO2 measurement at the absolute end of the respiration. End-tidal CO2, that does exist. It's existed for a long time. There's very little, if any, pre-hospital paramedic services that don't have end-tidal carbon dioxide measuring abilities. Generally, you can do that on a conscious patient or an unconscious patient. Okay, so it doesn't matter the state, we can measure their end-tidal carbon dioxide. That's amazing. First thing to note, and this is just straight up memorization, there's no tricks, EtCO2 is anywhere between 35 and 45 millimeters of mercury. And much like the blood we've already mentioned, if you were at perfect homeostasis, something like 40 millimeters of mercury would be ideal. Of course, that's not the way the human body works. You're consistently moving up and down from homeostasis, right or left of homeostasis. So that's the ballpark we're looking for, anywhere between 35 and 45 millimeters of mercury. We can measure that on people all the time, and it'll give you a direct reflection of their current respiratory status. What would cause respiratory acidosis? So let's think about it. The respiratory system's job is to get rid of CO2. What if, and it doesn't matter why for now, we decrease respirations, we take them from 12 to 6. So we decrease them by half. Well, you're going to get rid of half the CO2. But the metabolism of the body has not changed. The metabolism of the body is the same, and we're creating CO2 at the same rate of speed. If you needed to have your respirations at 12 to expel CO2, then that means your respirations will now be so low that you're accumulating CO2 faster than you're getting rid of it, right? Any situation that decreases respirations or decreases the depth of respirations, meaning the amount of air exchanged, or decreases the efficiency of respirations, meaning the lungs aren't working as well as they should, will result in respiratory acidosis. Okay? So would respiratory arrest result in it? Yeah, that's not breathing at all. That's the worst case scenario. Cardiac arrest, well, that means you're essentially dead. And yeah, you're not breathing. Of course, it's going to lead to it. Any type of central nervous system depression will cause a decrease in respirations and will lead to respiratory acidosis, right? And I'm not going to go through the millions of things that can cause respiratory acidosis. That would be a terrible way to learn. What you want to know is, if my respiratory rate and depth is not adequate, I will not be able to expel CO2 faster than it's being created, and I will end up in a state where my body has too much CO2 and I am considered to be in respiratory acidosis. So why is that bad? It's bad because your pH will drop below 7.4, and we've already talked about why that's bad in the first slide. How would we know this is happening? We can measure EtCO2. So once that EtCO2 goes above 45 millimeters of mercury, you are considered to be in respiratory acidosis. Okay? The higher it goes, the worse the respiratory acidosis is. You might notice a discrepancy between pH and EtCO2, and I had mentioned this earlier. EtCO2, as it goes higher, keep in mind what it's actually representing, N-titled carbon dioxide. It means that there's even more carbon dioxide, which means there's even more hydrogen ions, which means you're even more acidotic, right? It's a direct reflection of metabolism. So the higher that EtCO2 goes, the more acidotic you are. So when talking about respiratory acidosis, we're looking for generally a drop in pH and a rise in EtCO2. Okay, they kind of are opposite one another in the direction that they go, but that's both acidotic. Just some kind of stuff that can cause it. Now, the thing is, when you learn about acid-base balance, you learn about the basics. And then what you do is every single time you go over a medical emergency, you learn about how it affects acid-base balance. So it's something you learn about forever, but you learn about in increments. So just some basic stuff here. Decreased rate and depth of breathing leads to an accumulation of CO2, which is respiratory acidosis. Any obstruction of air passages and any decreased gas exchange. So those last two things, obstruction of air passages and decreased gas exchange, those are particular disease processes. There's hundreds of disease processes that lead to that. Real quick, simple example, asthma. Okay, can lead to respiratory acidosis and will when you have an asthma attack, so to speak. So that's just something to keep in mind. There is traumatic ways that you can have respiratory acidosis as well. So physical trauma to your thorax will likely cause respiratory acidosis, because if you remember from anatomy and physiology, the reason you can exchange gas at all is the consistent change in shape of your thorax. Your thorax gets bigger, more air rushes in due to negative pressure. Your thorax gets smaller, more air comes out. If you get hit in the side of the chest by a cow while loading a trailer and smash 6 or 7 ribs on your left side, those ribs are now free floating. Okay, it's what's called a flail chest. They're not going to move in synchrony with the rest of the thorax. And so you're going to have decreased gas exchange due to physical trauma. So any physical trauma to the thorax can cause respiratory acidosis. And then there's just some examples of particular diseases that can cause respiratory acidosis. Again, it's more important that you understand what it is, respiratory acidosis. And then whenever you learn about medical emergencies, it will become kind of evident to you that they likely lead to this state. Anything that causes the retention of CO2, which leads to an increase in EtCO2 and respiratory acidosis. If you had blood work, you could get PCO2, which is the CO2 in the blood. But we're going to be using EtCO2. So clinical indications are pH of less than 7.35. Why is that there? It's because if your patient is currently in respiratory acidosis that you're dealing with, which you can measure with your EtCO2, it is safe to assume, generally speaking, that their pH is now below 7.35. Now, there's a lot of factors to consider here. Okay, how long have they been in respiratory acidosis? That matters. But let's say, for an example, a patient who's been short of breath for 3 days and you arrive and their EtCO2 is 75 millimeters of mercury. That's really high. It's incredibly high, incredibly out of homeostasis. Now, if it's been 3 days they're short of breath, it would be safe to assume that they've been working up to that high EtCO2. It would also be safe to assume that their pH has dropped well below 7.4 and likely below 7.35. I'm not going to get too much into what happens once you become acidotic in terms of signs and symptoms, as because you can see some signs and symptoms of acidosis. Headache, weakness, confusion, and disorientation. Sure, it's not very useful to know that stuff, okay? And here's why. You're going to know they're in respiratory acidosis never because of that stuff, but because of your EtCO2 and because of the current illness they're complaining of being associated with respiratory acidosis. What you really need to know about respiratory acidosis, or any acidosis, is that the body stops functioning well when it's in an acidotic state. Almost every chemical reaction begins to malfunction and eventually will stop functioning. And again, once those chemical reactions stop happening, you're not alive anymore. Just some other signs of acidosis. Hypoxia is just often associated with respiratory acidosis. It's not an effect of it, but it is often associated with it. So then what can we do about respiratory acidosis? Actually, we can do a ton, can't we? Because we're paramedics. So when they end up in this acidotic state, it is often, not always, but often due to a ventilation problem, meaning they literally mechanically are not ventilating themselves enough. They are not exchanging enough gas. They're not doing it at a fast enough rate or at a deep enough rate. We can breathe for human beings. That's what bag valve mask ventilations are. So we can, even if they're conscious, put a bag valve mask on their face and force the respirations to be what we want them to be. So we make the respirations, let's say 14 very deep, efficient respirations. Let's say the problem with them is some type of respiratory illness, and we'll just keep it simple, asthma. Let's say they have obstruction of the bronchial passages. Well, we open those up, don't we, with salbutamol and maybe even epinephrine, depending on the case, and then we breathe for them. Let's say they're dead, VSA, vital signs absent. We can intubate them, and we can breathe for them. We can put in an LMA and breathe for them. We could keep it simple and just use a bag valve mask if everything's working well and breathe for them. So the fix to respiratory acidosis we have. And it's not to give a crazy drug or interfere with the physiology directly on the cellular level. It's to fix the mechanical problem that led to it, which is generally respiratory disease, treating that, or actually ventilating the patient. So that's respiratory acidosis in a nutshell. Again, it's not that you know everything you need to know about it. You learn more about it as you learn about particular disease processes and how they end up causing respiratory acidosis. And that's the way I like to teach it, and that's the way I'm going to teach it. I think that's the best way to do it. So the goal here is really just to know the basics of what respiratory acidosis is so you can anticipate that it may happen and that you know how we generally treat it. But again, how we treat it is dependent on what caused it, which is why we keep it lumped in with particular disease processes. Next video is going to be on respiratory alkalosis, and then we'll keep going down the line. If you like videos like this, subscribe, share, whatever, and yeah, keep posted for more videos.